Welcome to our JC Raulston midweek program. Today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, bulbs. And for the purpose of this class, I'm going to use bulb in a very general sense. People more technical, or people with a need to be more technical, will argue that some of these are not bulbs. And they are right, but just like we understand that a catfish is not a cat, we understand that when we use the term bulb in a general sense, that some of these are not technically bulbs. Just for starters, one real common question when planting bulbs is which side is up. The majority of bulbs are fairly readily identifiable as which side is up, because a lot of bulbs are sort of pointed at the top side. This is a fairly typical daffodil bulb, a narcissus. In the bulb world, these separate parts are referred to as noses. So this particular bulb is comprised of 3 noses, but this pointed end is the point that goes up. If you flip it over, you see some dried roots from last year, just like you usually do when you're preparing an onion in the kitchen. An onion is a true bulb, just like this daffodil is. And tulips also have a definite pointed top. This one is shedding its tunic, and tunic is another term used in the bulb world for this papery outer covering. It's being lost on this bulb, which is fine. It'll be just fine. But you see it has most definitely a pointed top. And again, you look at the base, you can see not so many old dried roots from last year, but just around the true stem of the bulb, there's little white root initials. I don't know if that shows up on camera, but it does. Mm-hmm. Wonderful, Chris. And this is your more normal size standard tulip, but there's some little species tulip, and this is a normal bulb for that. But again, the same situation, the pointed top, and then the basal plate where the roots are produced. And both the daffodil and the tulips are true bulbs. There's real magic in a true bulb, because the flower and the foliage it's going to produce next spring is already inside this. All it needs is to be planted and have the proper chilling period, and it will bloom next spring. Now, this is a crocus bulb. And technically, this is not a true bulb, but it is a corm, which is a compressed stem. No, that's not, it's partly true, but it has somewhat of a pointed top. This is a little species crocus, so it's about half the size of, like the big Dutch crocus. And often, other types of crocus, you'll see the little pointed growth bud on the top of the bulb. And again, it has the same basal plate on the bottom from which the roots are produced. But in the group of plants that we describe as bulbs in a general sense, there are things like this. This is an anemone. Now, not all anemones have an underground storage unit like this. Like the fall blooming Japanese anemones that are blooming this time of year, they don't have any kind of bulb underground. They just have a fibrous root system. But some anemones do have a bulb. Technically, this is a tuber, and tubers can be either tuberous roots or tuberous stems, and this is actually a tuberous stem. Because it's like a really compressed stem, and buds are produced on the upper part and then bulbs on the under. side. Now, when it comes to deciding which side is up, it's a little bit difficult to know for sure. But if you're not sure, you can always plant it on its side. And, you know, the shoots will come up from one direction and the roots will go down. No matter which direction you plant them, the plant still knows which way is up and which way is down. And left in the ground, they will tend to right themselves over the years. And a lot of bulbs also have what are known as contractile roots, these thick, fleshy roots whose purpose is to either pull the bulb upright or pull the bulb deeper into the ground. So that's probably enough to say about which side is up. And as I pointed out, with many of these, it's fairly obvious. And then again, if you can't figure out which side is up, you can always plant it on its side. And most of all, just don't sweat it. The plants are going to grow no matter how they get planted. Now, I do want to point out something different about these anemones. And I never even said what type of anemone. This is the Florist Anemone or the poppy anemone. It's probably grown even more for the cut flower trade than it is for garden display, but it's a superb plant for garden display because it will produce a long succession of flowers over at least 6 weeks, if not 8 weeks. And so even though they often don't come back the second spring, you certainly get your money's worth out of them the first spring. But they are a Mediterranean plant and used to a very long, hot, dry summer. And so these tubers shrivel. And when you get them, you need to soak them overnight or even 24 hours before you plant them. They'll get off to a much quicker start if you soak them. And it's not as dramatic a change as I'm used to when I have store-bought tubers of the anemones, but these have been soaking for almost 24 hours and they have plumped up. These are ones that bloomed here last spring, and after they went dormant, we dug them and dried them off, and they've just been in my office all summer. It's sort of an experiment. Because they often don't survive the summer here when they're dormant, I thought, well, maybe what they need is just to be dug and stored dry so they get the usual dry rest that they expect in the summer. So we'll plant these sometime soon and see how they do this spring. I can't think of, one other bulb you might soak would be winter aconites if you're buying them from a bulb nursery. Winter aconites are often hard to get established when you're planting store-bought bulbs. The best way to get it started is either buy a pot-grown plant, or if you know somebody who has some to share, if you transplant them while they're still growing, they'll transplant very readily and get established. But initially, when you buy store-bought bulbs, they often don't grow, or only a small percentage of them will grow. And the tuber is just like this, but used initially on a smaller scale. And the winter aconites and the anemones are both in the same family, the big ranunculus family, which includes some bulbous members, but non-bulbous things such as hellebores and clematis. It's a really large and diverse family. Okay. Now, the tools, you have a number of options for planting. Maybe the first device that everybody buys when they're going to plant a lot of bulbs is this bulb planter. It's like a soup can on a stick. Now, if you're going to go this way, buy a real heavy-duty one, which this is. It's, pretty good thick steel. a lightweight one is probably going to be more trouble than not. And even having said that, I don't always find this the best way to dig a hole, especially if your soil is rocky or hard or rooty. And if your conditions are such that this tool works well, what I think works really well if you can conscript somebody is to work in a pair. So one person is upright digging this hole, and then the other person down on the ground tucking the bulb in and putting the soil back in. Now, that's a good sized bulb for the daffodil or a big tulip. And it's deep enough. Sometimes the depths that are recommended for planting bulbs are a little bit deep if your soil is not very well drained. But this one will allow you to have like 2-3 inches of soil on top of the bulb. Of course, other options are just a hand tool, a trowel, or my all-purpose tool, the weeding knife, for digging, especially for smaller bulbs. For bigger things, I think it's much better to dig either with a shovel or with a garden fork. Now, I've mentioned this in the past. If you're shopping for a garden fork, buy one of these with square tines. They're not, you often don't find them. Usually what you find are the ones with the flat tines. This has been used for about a year and the tines are still largely in line, whereas the ones with flat tines bend really readily. The first time you encounter a large rock or a tree root and bend back, one of those tines is going to end up bent out of shape. But, I don't know that there's one advantage to a fork over the shovel for digging a hole. Fork is sometimes easier to get in the ground. And you can plant bulbs individually. You can dig a hole and plant a group of them together. And anytime you buy some bulbs, it'll come with recommended spacing and depth to plant it. Now, if I was Martha Stewart, I would have already had the hole dug. This soil is real loose, so the shovel is working better for actually removing the soil from the hole. Okay. So you can take something like these anemones, which, again, I think I know which side is up, and just space them in the hole. I'm putting them about 3 inches apart. Probably could space them a little bit further apart. And so that's one option, or you can certainly, there they are. And certainly, plant these in individual holes with the trowel. A lot of bulbs, as soon as they're planted, are going to start developing roots. Most of them will then not produce any top growth until spring. But there are quite a few bulbs that will put up top growth almost as soon as they have some root system developed. And a lot of beginning gardeners worry when some bulbs have foliage at this time of year. But there's quite a few bulbs that already have foliage, things like grape hyacinths, the muscari, and the starflower Iphion, and certain types of daffodils. Paper white daffodils already have almost a foot of growth. Now, I don't recommend paper whites for zone 7 because the foliage often gets hurt by the cold, but other daffodils, such as some of the little species daffodils like Bulbocodium or the wild species jonquils, they have foliage come fall, and the foliage will be present all winter and spring and then go dormant in late spring or early summer. That's their normal life cycle. And a lot of the bulbs that grow through the winter months are usually of Mediterranean origin, so they're dormant in the hot, dry summer, and then they come into growth in the fall and grow through the winter months when there's moisture available in the soil. And there are other plants that are dormant through the summer and then growing through the winter months. And some of those are woodland plants that make use of the sun and the increased moisture availability in the winter and then go dormant once the trees leaf out in spring, late spring. A lot of our woodland spring ephemerals have that life cycle. The little cranefly orchid comes up in the fall and grows through the winter, or toothwort, dentaria, is dormant in the summer and already has a nice amount of foliage covering the ground. So don't panic when you see bulbs produce foliage in the fall, because they're probably just doing what they always do. You don't need to protect it. On a really cold morning, it might look miserable, but usually once they thaw out, they return to their normal appearance. A lot of plants with foliage in the winter look like they're wilting in a real cold spell. Well, they are essentially, but it's intentional. They move water out of the cells into the spaces in between the cells, which is why the leaves look wilted. But that way, when the leaf freezes, the water is not inside the cell and won't rupture the cell membrane. And that's why they are essentially wilting in a cold spell, but it's intentional and temporary. So don't panic when your newly planted bulbs are up. Let's see what I have here. We did a little shopping today to get some examples of bulbs. So, there's a lot that we can talk about beyond just the planting of bulbs and what sort of bulbs we would recommend planting this time of year. We can start off with, that's not a daffodil. We can start off with daffodils because it's an easy one, because almost any daffodil is going to be a satisfactory performer in your garden. You have your choice from trumpets to cyclaminius types, and this is a split corona where the trumpet is split and laying flat against the outer tepals. There's big eyes, and the newest introductions are incredibly big. And then there's also a lovely range of miniatures. And this is just sort of an average sized daffodil. If you were buying the highest grade bulbs of the biggest varieties, they'll often be twice this size. And, there's it's nice to plant a range of different daffodil varieties because they will bloom. One variety will be in bloom in March and another in April. And actually, one of our favorites is one that's often in bloom before the end of December, and that's Rinveld's Early Sensation. Ordinary looking golden trumpet, but in bloom in December and early January. And I like to place the big daffodils, the big narcissus, in towards the back of the bed where you see them when they're in bloom, but then after they're done blooming, you don't have to stare at their large, to my mind, somewhat gloomy looking foliage. The smaller daffodils are really nice because their foliage is also much smaller. Let's talk about tulips. Most people have gardened. Everybody wants to grow tulips. I love tulips, and but most people know that many tulips are only bloom well their first spring. They might have a few smaller flowers the next year, but many varieties, after the first spring, you might not have any flowers at all and just some foliage. But there are some tulips that will give you a number of years of bloom, and there's a big class of tulips. The tulips are divided into a number of classes, and one of them is Darwin Hybrids. Darwin, like the scientist who developed the theory of evolution. I don't know if it's at all related to him, but it's the same family name. Now, it's important that you select Darwin Hybrids and not Darwin tulips. Darwin Hybrids will last for quite a few years in the garden, whereas Darwin tulips, which are one of the parents of the Darwin Hybrids, will not. So many bulbs have been bred more for the cut flower or potted bulb trade and less for garden performance. But the Darwin Hybrids are really good long-term tulips in the garden, provided they aren't eaten by voles or deer or rabbits or squirrels. But if they don't suffer that fate, they will come back for years. Now, the other group of tulips that give the Darwin Hybrids their permanence are the emperor tulips or the Fosteriana tulips, the two names for the same group. And most people have gardened know the old variety of tulip, red emperor. And there's a number of other tulips in the emperor or Fosteriana class, and they generally will bloom for quite a few years. So those two groups are far more permanent in the garden than most other groups. But all of them are worth planting just because they're so beautiful when they do bloom. Now, the tulips we've talked about are things that are far removed from their original wild parents. They're garden hybrids. People have been growing tulips for many centuries. But there are lots of species tulips, wild tulips, that aren't really improved from the wild. And some of them are really difficult. Some of them are not good plants for us. Some of them we succeed with here at the Arboretum because we have some planting areas that are more like the desert environments where they are native, such as the extremely well-drained soil up on the roof of the building here. But there are a few species tulips that are quite permanent in the garden. Probably the best known one is the peppermint tulip, Tulipa clusiana. These are smaller flowered tulips. The flower on the peppermint tulip is about that size. But provided the growing conditions are correct, which is just a sunny location when they're in growth and average drainage or better soil, they generally get better year after year and can even start seeding around. their bulbs are small. These are normal size bulbs for this type of tulip with this beautiful sort of chestnut brown tunic on the bulb. And another one I highly recommend is this tulip Lilac Wonder. It puts up foliage in the fall, beautiful glossy foliage, and then blooms. It's about a foot tall in bloom, and the flower stalk is branched, so each one will have several flowers. But again, it tends to get better year after year. And its bulbs are the same size as the Tulipa clusiana. I think these little bulbs are so pretty. They're well clothed in this tunic is sort of a red-brown. And, you know, these are smaller tulips. They could go, you know, as deep as the big ones, but they also would get by with less soil on top of them. Now, if voles are the problem you deal with in your garden, and voles will eat some of these bulbs. They tend not to eat daffodils or other members of the Amaryllis family. The daffodils are in the Amaryllis family. But they will eat tulips and crocus, and so you can put them in mesh baskets or even just sink a pot in the ground. I know somebody who has a really large hosta collection, and all of them are planted in pots which are sunk in the ground, and some reason the voles tend not to figure out how to jump over the rim of the pot in there. So that's one way to succeed with tulips. The alliums are another group where some are really good for us, and others either don't bloom well the first year or bloom well the first year and don't persist after that. Some of the alliums we do well with have a small bulb about the size of this crocus corn, but others have great big bulbs. This is actually Schubertii, which has sort of this fireworks-like head of flowers, real long, slender flower stalks with lots of small flowers. And it's a true bulb shaped much like the tulips and such, with the pointed top and then the basal plate where the roots arise. And it's one that this particular Allium Schubertii, is one that does last for us for quite a few years. Many of these alliums put up foliage in late winter and in early spring, and then they bloom later than most of these other bulbs, and often by the time they bloom, the foliage is already going dormant. So the foliage might be a little bit shabby at that time, but if they were planted where they're coming up through low ground covering plants, you won't even notice it. A really good allium for garden ornaments is the big giant or elephant garlic that you'd buy in the grocery store. It's not as brightly colored as the fancy hybrids, but it is one that will persist in your garden forever. The foliage is broad like a leek. I think the foliage on the elephant garlic is handsome in its own right. And it's 3-4 feet tall when it blooms. There is a modern selection that's probably bred from the giant garlic called Summer Drummer that is close to 6 feet tall when it blooms. And the flower heads isn't gigantic like some of the big Dutch hybrids, but it's probably a good 4 inches across or so, and more brightly colored than the wild elephant garlic. Let's see. You know, our focus thus far has been planting bulbs at this time of year, but it's also a good time of year transplant bulbs. And they can be ones that are already in active growth. This is a wonderful South American bulb. It's Rhodophylla. It's essentially done blooming. This is one little fading flower. It's a naked flower stalk, the scape, with 4 or 5 flowers up on the top, looking very much like its relatives Amaryllis. They are dormant in the summer. They start putting up foliage and about the same time they're blooming. And a really nice feature of this Rhodophylla, it has several flushes of bloom, at least 2, maybe 3 flushes of bloom. So it'll bloom thoroughly, and I think it's done. And then a few weeks later, there's another whole flush of bloom, which is really nice because so many things like spider lilies, which are such a treat when they bloom, it's, that one flush of bloom is all that you're going to get. But this is one clump that had gotten really quite large. And, if you want to maximize your increase, well, when most bulbs, when they get crowded, they don't bloom quite as well as when they're less crowded. And you see they already have roots, which isn't surprising since they also have foliage. These are easy to divide because they're separate of each other. And you see these are true bulbs like the tulips and the daffodils and such. You see the structure is very much like those other true bulbs. And that's a blooming size bulb. Not that it's not going to bloom again this year, it's done, but this bulb will certainly bloom next spring. But when you divide them, a lot of these smaller bulbs, like these two, will have a better chance of growing to full size and become blooming size bulbs. These probably did not bloom this fall because they weren't yet big enough to bloom. Often when I've transplanted bulbs, I end up with far more than I imagined, and it can become quite a chore to replant them all. And you can plant these individually, and each bulb has the potential to, in time, to become a huge clump like this. It is one of the delights of gardening that you can start off with one or a limited number of something, and after not that many years you have a wealth of them. Or again, you could plant them multiple ones in a hole, spreading them out a bit. It all depends on how big a display of them you want in the garden. If you want to line your whole property with them, you can do that. Or you could, certainly plant them individually with that bulb digger. Now, because these are already in active growth, as soon as I have them in the ground, I would soak them thoroughly. They'll grumble a little bit about being transplanted while they're actively growing, but they'll settle in and they'll be, next fall they'll bloom just fine. There are some bulbs like spider lilies, when you transplant them, they might take a year off before they settle back in and bloom really well. But with that 1 year off, you'll end up ultimately with far more flowers since the bulbs now have room to become full-sized. And as far as watering them, this soil is dry. It always amazes me how much rain it takes to rehydrate a dry soil. If we planted all these dormant bulbs today and we didn't water them, they'll be just fine. But if you want them to get off to a quicker start, then soak them after you have planted them. And with that soil moisture, some of these will produce new roots amazingly rapidly. you know, and if you can find other bulbs in your garden that need to be divided, you know, you can go ahead and do that, whether they're daffodils or starflowers or almost anything. The problem with the bulbs that are dormant now, it's sometimes hard to find them. These ones with top growth, they're obviously real easy to find, and then you can spread them around your garden or share a few with friends. What else can I say? How are we doing for time? Good. Okay.
Doug, since it's on topic for the oxblood that you're talking about, Shauna just asked, is it okay to transplant the bulbs as the foliage dies back, because that's when she can find them? Later in the season, it's harder to find them.
These bulbs will tolerate being transplanted anytime. As a child, my mother said you transplanted the daffodils after they go dormant. The problem is after they go dormant, they're a whole lot harder to find. Mm-hmm. So I generally transplant bulbs when I can find them, which is usually while they still have top growth. You know, if there was a bad time to transplant bulbs, and it's not really a time that would threaten the health of the bulbs, but if you transplanted them before they bloom, like, you know, a few weeks before they bloom, they're going to be upset enough that the flower stalk probably won't stand up, and they'll probably be, you know, sort of puny or something like that. So if you want the floral display, transplant them after they bloom. But other than, you know, decreasing your flower display that year, you can transplant them anytime. They're forgiving. You know, as I said, they'll look, if you transplanted a big daffodil after it's done blooming, that foliage is going to collapse. It's going to look miserable. You'll think you made a mistake, but next spring you'll realize you didn't make a mistake at all. It's returning full force, and it's all that much stronger because you've spread them out. So timing isn't critical. I do think that something like this, that's an active growth, it's important to water them really well. This time of year, one thorough soaking might get them through the rest of the growing season, but that'll also depend on the weather. Right now we seem to be in a dry spell, except for the occasional 5-inch rain. But, you know, between those 5-inch rains, we go a week or two without significant rain. I haven't said anything about fertilizing, and I should, because instructions for planting bulbs often include sprinkling a little fertilizer in the hole. It's probably fine to put a little bit. I don't like to put much, and actually any time you apply fertilizer, it should be based on a soil test, so you know whether or not you really do need to add more phosphorus or potassium. And I think if you put too much fertilizer in, especially a chemical fertilizer like 10-10-10, you know what salt feels like on an open wound. You know, the tender roots being put out by the bulbs aren't going to enjoy soaking in you know, a salt solution either. If your soil test shows you need fertilizer, you can always top dress them, especially in the fall. And, you know, by time they're growing, the fertilizer will probably make its way down into the soil.
So one thing I remember, Doug, from some of my classes here at NC State, I can't remember if it was Gusta Hertog's class or Denny's class, but they said the best time to fertilize daffodils is just as the growth resumes, which is a root growth, when you can't find them.
Yeah.
And then every week after that, it gets to be a little worse and a little worse. And most people start to think about fertilizing their daffodils when they're in flower, and that's when you don't do it.
Well, you know, the truth of the matter is, if you did a soil test on the hole where the daffodils are being planted, those same results probably apply to the whole bed. Yep. And so I would just broadcast fertilizer across the whole bed.
Yep.
Because the other plants in that area would benefit from the fertilizer as well.
But that was good that you went off to the fertilizer because that was your very next question. So you got that one covered.
Okay.
Russell has simply asked, what about Gladiolus? You got some general comments about Gladiolus for them?
I am thankful for that question because this is the time of year when you would dig bulbs that are not winter hardy, such as caladiums. If you left caladiums in the ground over winter, they'll be dead in the spring. And I'm sure it's partly, maybe entirely the cold because they are of tropical South American origin. They also want to be dry when they're dormant. So this is the time of year to dig caladiums, and the caladium bulbs, again, are not true bulbs, but are tuberous stems like these anemones, and they look very much like these, just sort of irregular, lumpy things. And I have done this for years. I just dig them, put them in a paper bag or a cardboard box, and just store them somewhere where it's warm. They do not want to freeze over winter. Often they spend the winter in the file cabinet drawer in my office or at home. It might be almost anywhere, on a shelf under the plant cart or under the kitchen sink with the potatoes and onions. Caladiums are super easy to overwinter, and so don't worry about packing them in peat moss or rice hulls or anything like that. They don't need any special care. But you'll want to dig them while you can still find them. With these 40-degree nights, the foliage is grumbling and quickly going dormant.
Yep. That's what I was going to add, Doug. One of the things we learned when we visited Brent and Becky was you don't wait for it to get cold with them. I can't remember if it was 50 or 45, but when they said the nights get low to those temperatures, they don't like it and they'll start getting some damage. So you need to dig them up before it gets that cold, and we've already hit it. So people should be digging up their caladiums by now or bringing them in.
A lot of our best plants for summer displays are tropical plants that we treat as annuals. And, they thrive when the weather is hot and humid. But they sure do grumble when it's no longer summertime here.
Yep,
but
mine's already doing that.
So that was a very roundabout way to get to Russell's question about gladiolus. Most gladiolus in this area can be left in the ground. They almost always overwinter. Now, when I was quite young, my grandfather gave me gladiolus and my own little duster, my pump action duster for dusting them with DDT. And you wonder why I've turned out the way I have. And this was in northeastern New Jersey, and they do not survive a zone 6 winter and have to be dug. But one of the benefits of gardening here in a warmer climate is the ground never freezes enough to hurt the corms, the bulbs of a gladiola.
Well, this kind of goes off to Nancy's question, which is up next. She's asked, will bulbs that have been stored in a bag since last spring, if planted now, still flower?
What type of bulbs?
She just said bulbs.
Okay.
So let's just assume daffodils.
Well, does this mean they had a normal life cycle in the ground and then got dug in the spring?
I'm guessing they were dug when they went dormant and
yeah.
Just been sitting in the bag since.
Yeah. The majority of the tulips and daffodils that are sold in this country are grown in Holland. Now, they're very mild summers. They probably are I know for a fact that they're in leaf longer because Brent Heath from Brent and Becky's Bulbs has said that bulbs grow better in Holland because with that mild summers, they stay in leaf longer, so they have sort of a longer growing season. But as soon as they start going dormant, they're dug from the fields and put into storage. So if that's all she's done. Now, if she stored them in the refrigerator, I know somebody who did that one year. And so when they planted them in the fall, they immediately came into growth and then were hurt by the cold weather. So if you're going to store them over the summer, don't store them in the refrigerator, just store them at regular room temperature.
Right. And Cindy has asked, will Amaryllis bulbs tolerate the winter months here? We'll assume Raleigh. Or should they be dug up and replanted in the spring?
Most of the common ones come through the winter just fine. And our winters are a lot milder than they were when we first started realizing that the modern hybrid Amaryllis are generally winter hardy. When Dr. de Hertog was doing his research here on bulbs, we often had the discards from his research and they went in the ground, and some of them are still in the garden.
Yeah, they are. They're beautiful.
Yeah.
Laura, who's out from more of the coastal area, Zone 7A, is asking about chilling. She's wondering if the bulb should be chilled prior to planting.
Well, when you get into warmer regions where there's less chilling, then there's certain varieties of daffodils that do less well and others that do even better. The paper whites are Narcissus tazetta. Tazetta is the species. Well, Narcissus tazetta is the species. Paper whites do better in those milder coastal climates. Now, I can't abide the smell of paper white, so I didn't. That was one aspect of living in Zone 8 I didn't enjoy, because when they came in bloom in late fall or early winter, it always smelled like a horse manure with far too much grandma's perfume on it, or dead mouse. They smell like dead rotting bodies too. But anyhow, there's a group of daffodil hybrids known as Tazetta hybrids, and because they have that Tazetta as one of its parents, they tend to be better for milder areas than other daffodil classes that are more from northern, species that are native to colder climates.
Paul, one of our regulars from the Wilmington area, commented that the narcissus are the ones that he has most success with, and they don't need coddling like a lot of the other ones do.
Which narcissus?
He just said narcissus overall, but I think your suggestion for the Tazetta types is a good suggestion for that.
Oh, perhaps he meant that narcissus in general are easier there than other types of bulbs like tulips.
Yeah, that was
or
just
something.
an overall statement.
Well, yeah, I don't know if you would need to buy pre-chilled tulips to succeed in Wilmington. But they're available if you buy bulbs from a mail order nursery such as Brent and Becky's Bulbs. They sell quite a few different selections of tulips and other bulbs that have been pre-chilled. Though I think that's more for like, Florida or somewhere where they get almost no chilling. I mentioned that a lot of these bulbs, when you plant them, are going to quickly make roots, but they won't. Most of them won't produce any shoot growth until they have enough chilling. And that's not temperatures below freezing, but just temperatures below 40.
So Carolyn, one of our regulars as well, has asked about elephant ears, which really aren't the topic of today's
it's fine.
conversation, but they're still a good bulb.
No, well,
maybe what care might be needed this time of the year. She just simply asked, what about elephant ears? So let's just say, what do you do this time of the year for elephant ears?
Well, this is the time of year to deal with the bulbs we plant this time of year, and also the summer bulbs that sometimes we need to deal with. In the warmer end of Zone 7, such as Raleigh, elephant ears generally are winter hardy, especially Colocasia, which is the common one. Now, one problem with elephant ears is the thing we think of as a bulb is actually a tuberous stem. So the nature of it is actually to continue growing up out of the ground. And if it's grown up above the ground, even a mild winter here will tend to kill it to the ground. So you lose the terminal bud. But the part of the tuberous stem, the bulb underground that remains alive, all those side buds will grow. So initially, you won't have great big leaves. You'll have a lot of these smaller shoots. But elephant ears are also extremely easy to overwinter. Just dig them off, dig them out, clean them off, and just store them dry somewhere in the someplace in the house where they are warm and not freezing. And if you get hungry, you can always cook them, because elephant ears are the source of taro, one of the most important food crops in the world.
Mm-hmm. We have another participant that's looks like she's trying to do the opposite with Amaryllis. She seems to already have some out in the beds and would like to grow them in containers. Any recommendations on what you can do to dig them up and put them in pots? Like timing?
Well, if you're going to grow them in pots, then maybe you want to dig them before they lose all their foliage, though it really wouldn't matter. Mm-hmm. The directions for growing and blooming Amaryllis are unnecessarily complicated. Amaryllis do not have to be dried off. They do not need any treatment to make them bloom. The only thing they need to make them bloom is to have a really good summer. If they are grown well, if they've had lots of foliage, if they've gotten plenty of sun and water when they need it, and fertilizer if the soil isn't already fertile, they're going to make those flower buds over the course of the summer, and those flower buds are going to bloom come winter. Whether you force them into dormancy or you put them in the closet, which is totally unnecessary. If they make those flower buds over summer, it's inevitable that they're going to bloom in the winter. So, just relax, grow them well, whether in the container or in the ground, and they're going to bloom in the spring. Now, some of that forcing into dormancy and stuff might get them, you might have a little bit more control over when they bloom. If you need them to bloom by Christmas, I'd probably buy a fresh bulb that's already been treated to bloom at Christmas. But I've been growing the same Amaryllis since, more than 40 years. It's a gorgeous species, Amaryllis, and unfortunately it's not one that's winter hardy, but if I neglect it and it goes bone dry, it's going to go dormant and lose all its foliage. If I continue watering it, it'll keep the foliage all winter long. But regardless which way I treat it, it still blooms in January, February or so.
You were saying it's definitely not needed, but I personally find it rather convenient because I let them just die outside with the frost, and I just put them in the garage until February or so, and then bring them in, enjoy the flowers, and it's kind of timed that after the flowers are done, I can put them right back outside. Are
you leaving them in the pots over summer?
I do leave them in the pots.
Okay.
Yep.
I think if you want to grow in containers, you might as well leave them in containers year round rather than unpotting them and repotting them. When you pot up a dormant bulb in the cool, dark days of late fall and winter, they're not going to reestablish all that readily. But left in a container, they'll be just fine.
So Emily has
convenience is a really big part of why the bulb trade forces Amaryllis into bloom. Just think about it. It's a whole lot easier to transport this large bulb without roots and without foliage. Mm-hmm. But they don't have to be forced into dormancy.
Emily has an interesting question, not really about planting, at least not directly. She's wondering, how long does it take for Allium seedlings to grow to a size bulb that can produce flowers?
I do not know the answer to that question. I do think it's going to vary. This is a pretty good sized bulb. If I can get it out of the bag. I'm sure from seed, it's going to take several years. Mm-hmm. But some of the alliums that we do really well with, like the drumstick allium and allium molly and some others, it might just take if you sowed the seed in the spring and grew it really well, it might take, 12 or 18 months before it's blooming size. We certainly have grown a lot of alliums from seed that are ones that do not grow from a bulb but have a fibrous root system. And certainly by their second growing season, they're blooming.
So it looks like our questions and comments in the chat are growing faster than we
Oh,
can
dear.
get to them, which is great because this is a wonderful topic. So maybe we'll just address a couple of more because we're right at 4 o'clock. Ruth has an interesting question for you. Do you have any bulbs in the scree garden? And she just comments that she wants to try some that need some sharp drainage herself. So any good recommendations?
Well, if you have an area with really good drainage, you can succeed with some things that we do not succeed with elsewhere, such as some of the more difficult species tulip, like not Tulipa linifolia, that's actually easy, but there's lots of, it might be Tulipa pulchella, which means pretty. You know, if you go online and visit some bulb nurseries website, you'll find a lot of little species tulips, and some of those are almost impossible to grow in, you know, regular clay, but in a sharp drainage you could. You know, go to a specialty bulb nursery like Odyssey Bulbs. You know, this late in the year, they're probably totally sold out of everything because they sell out real quickly. Everything they sell is rare and choice, but always in limited quantities.
So how about if we just do a couple more questions?
Sure.
I have one lined up that looked like a good one. I just saw one that was also great because native ones certainly came into a lot of the conversation in the chat. So up first is one from Joan. She's asked, what can you do about squirrels digging all her bulbs up?
Hot pepper, and I'm serious about this. You know, I was doing a lot of planting for a friend, and she had countless crocus and snowdrops and other little treasures and small daffodils, and the squirrels were just burrowing everywhere. And I know that hot pepper flakes are put into birdseed to keep squirrels from bothering the birdseed. So I said, well, why don't you try scattering hot pepper flakes on the ground? And it worked like a charm.
Oh, great.
You know, I don't know if it's a taste thing or just, you know, it might start burning their mouths, or they probably have the same reaction to hot peppers that a lot of us do. And, you know, if you go in the grocery store and you buy one of those precious little jars of hot peppers, it's going to cost you a bundle. But if you go to like one of the Asians or Latin markets, you can buy great big cellophane bags of, or a big jar for a whole lot less money. So it's not, you know, an costly thing to do, but that certainly worked like a charm.
Any experience with using permatil or a sharp gravel at all, personally?
No, I don't personally have experience with that.
Okay.
Up until recent years, I've gardened where I didn't have troubles with voles or squirrels, partly because back then I had cats.
And let's just treat this one as the final question because they're still coming in and it's getting a little late. Sharon has asked, do you have any suggestions for native bulbs? And earlier it was asked in the chat, what could be some good sources for some native bulbs as well?
Well, provided you know, I don't know whether you're talking about native to Wake County or are as expansive as North American natives.
How about we just do Southeast?
Well, I was going to talk about Camasias, because Camasias are great bulbs that tend to get better every year, and Camasias are a bulb that actually will tolerate poorly drained or wet soils. And the ones that are widely available are native to the Pacific Northwest, but there is a Camasia that's native to the Southeast. And it's a lovely thing, you know, maybe about 12 or 18 inches tall, a spike of sky blue flowers. But what is our native Camasia? Well, if you go into some online nursery that sells native plants, it might be Prairie Moon or New Moon Nursery sells those. And our native Adamasco lily is our only, other than maybe some obscure species in Florida, it's the only native rain lily or Zephyranthes. And that's one to look for. It's a real easy plant in gardens. It's spring blooming, whereas the other Zephyranthes native to the Southwest and Mexico tend to be summer and early fall blooming. But our Adamasco lilies look like almost like a Easter lily. The flowers are quite large, white things, and spring blooming. They occur locally. I collected seed 2 Julys ago and have some nice pots of them. So if you can find seed. And there's also the very active North American Wildflower Association. So they might be able to point you in the direction of those 2 native bulbs. Trout lilies are another native bulb. Mm-hmm. I guess trilliums would be considered bulbs. It's a short rhizome. And there's specialty nurseries like Plant Delights often has trilliums for sale. Edgewood Gardens often has trilliums for sale. I'm not, and I guess you could count our native Jack in the Pulpits as bulbs. It's very bulb-like. What?
That'd be a good one.
Yeah, and they're easy, and probably more readily available than some of the other ones I mentioned. Bulbs are much more common in areas with Mediterranean climates where they have a long dry summer that's not conducive to growth. So if you grow from a bulb, then you can hide under the ground during that dry season, and then come back into growth come the cooler rainy season. And that is not the climate of Eastern North America. A couple native Corydalus, squirrel corn, and Dutchman breeches grow from a bulb-like structure.
It's getting a little late, so I think that might be a good time to close on up, Doug.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Doug, for a great presentation on how to plant bulbs at this time of the year. It was a great discussion, and thank you all to everyone for showing up today for a wonderful midweek program. We look forward to seeing you next week at Wednesday, same place, right here on Zoom, for a great discussion with Barb Fair on how to plant some woody plants, some trees and shrubs. We'll see you then. Have a great week.
Thank you.